You weren't rejected. You just made it impossible for others to keep pretending. They didn't distance themselves because you were wrong. They did it because you were too real. And the truth always makes people uncomfortable. Since childhood, you were taught, if you're kind, sincere, and true to yourself, people will love you. But as you grew older, you discovered a different reality. The more honest you are, the more you're avoided. The clearer you are, the more you're seen as dangerous. The less you flatter others, the more you're labeled as arrogant. You sit in a crowded room, yet feel completely alone. Not because you didn't try to fit in, but because the more you tried, the more you lost yourself. They said you were different, but you simply didn't know how to fake it. They said you were too intense, but you just didn't enjoy small talk. They said you were too sensitive, but no one asked how many times you had to break before you learned to stay quiet. There were days you smiled, just to avoid questions, said you were fine, just so you wouldn't burden anyone, acted simple, just so your depth wouldn't scare them. But the real pain wasn't that people didn't understand you. The real pain was this. You truly believed that if you were honest enough, kind enough, patient enough, they would accept you. And then you realized you were never accepted because you never played the role they wanted. You were the one who dared to ask questions, while everyone else stayed silent. The one who shook your head when others nodded along. The one who said, "I disagree," when everyone else just went with it. You were the one who chose to be real in a world addicted to polite deception. And that is exactly why you were pushed out. Not because you were worse, not because you were wrong, not because you weren't good enough, but because you were a mirror reflecting what others didn't want to face in themselves. A person who lives authentically is a threat to those who live in disguise. A blunt voice unsettles those who rely on manipulation. A quiet soul disturbs those who are loud, just to avoid feeling you used to think, if they reject me, I must have done something wrong. But Carl Jung once said, what you resist not only persists, it grows in power. They don't hate you, they fear what you bring. Truth, depth, clarity. They fear being exposed, fear that you'll see the very thing they've tried to bury. So they avoid you, not to protect you, but to protect the illusion they live in. You thought you were an outsider, but really, you were the only one not acting. You thought you were excluded, but in truth, you just stepped out of a game you never wanted to play. The problem was never that you were too much. The truth is, they were not enough. Not honest enough, not brave enough, not ready to stand under the light of truth. Those who live authentically don't need to be welcomed everywhere, because their presence is a challenge. You either face it or you walk away. They didn't reject you. They rejected looking at themselves because you reflected too clearly. You're not alone. You just chose a path few are brave enough to walk. And if today you're sitting alone, wondering why you're always the one left out, take a step back and ask yourself quietly, was he rejected, or were they running from something inside themselves? Sometimes you don't need anyone to understand you. You just need to be silent long enough to hear your own voice say, I wasn't wrong. I just stopped pretending. Let's be honest. How many times have you shrunk yourself just so others wouldn't feel uncomfortable? How many times have you told yourself, next time, be softer, be simpler, don't be so deep? They don't like it. How many times have you cut parts of yourself off just to fit into a connection that wasn't real? The truth is, you were never wrong. You're simply someone with depth, someone real, and you're just too tired to pretend anymore. The problem was never you. It was the environment you were in, a place that values comfort over honesty. You're praised when you know how to read the room. You're loved when you say what people want to hear. You're accepted when you smile, even while you're falling apart inside. And if you don't play along, you're seen as difficult, too sensitive, negative, or emotionally intense. But have you ever asked yourself, why do I have to fake being happy, just to be allowed to stay? Why do I have to become an easy-to-swallow version of myself, just so I won't be devoured by silence? Have you ever felt torn inside? On one hand, you want to be understood. On the other, you must hide how you really feel. You want real connection, but are only allowed to exist at the surface level. So here's the real question. What are you holding on to that's keeping you stuck? You're holding yourself back, so others won't abandon you. You're choosing to play it safe, instead of being true. You're acting in a script that you didn't even write, and then you wonder, why am I so tired? Why do I keep retreating, silencing myself, bending who I am, just to fit into someone else's comfort? It's not because you're weak, it's because you're honest. And honesty always threatens a world that thrives on polished deception. The truth is, those who live authentically will always be seen as a threat. They don't hate you. They just don't know how to handle your presence. When you don't follow the script they're used to, you don't play the blame game. They feel exposed. You don't pretend to be okay. They feel guilty. You don't make excuses. They feel uncomfortable. You don't nod just to keep the peace. They call you too intense. You've tried many things, being agreeable, being softer, being quieter, even trying to seem more fun. But deep down, you know the truth. No version of yourself will ever be truly loved, except the real one. And that version is the one many are afraid of. Because people don't want to be close to someone with depth. People with depth are not easy to control. They don't agree just to fit in. They don't move with the crowd. And that makes the shallow ones feel unsafe. You were labeled different simply because you refused to be fake. You were pushed away, not because you didn't try, but because you refused to repeat the roles others expected you to play. And then you started doubting yourself. You asked, am I too sensitive, too serious, too heavy? No, you're just being real. In a world where pretending is the norm, and when truth shows up, it always provokes resistance. Carl Jung once said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But the path of becoming your true self is never crowded, because it demands sacrifice, giving up half-hearted approval for full truth, leaving behind safe applause for a freedom that's raw, quiet, and deeply powerful. To live authentically, you must learn to be misunderstood, to be rejected, without thinking something is wrong with you, to stand alone, while others cheer for what you know is false. And you? Are you willing to stand tall when people turn their backs? Are you willing to protect your truth when everyone around says, just let it go? Or will you continue to shrink your feelings just to be accepted? Hide your depth just to avoid isolation? Pretend to be pleasant just to keep relationships that aren't even real? You weren't rejected. You were just the only one who refused to play a game where the prize is a fake life. And that is when you must ask yourself, do I want to stay as a shadow of myself, or am I ready to walk away so I can keep my soul intact? You once tried being real, and then you realized it wasn't as welcomed as the self-help books claimed. You tried expressing your true feelings, and what you got back was silence, awkward glances, or a generic line like, don't be so negative. You tried sharing your genuine perspective, and people called you someone who overcomplicates things. You don't even know when it started, when you began shrinking into yourself, not because you were weak, but because every time you were real, you felt like an outsider. You were in the middle of a crowd, smiling on cue, nodding at the right moments, but deep down, You weren't really there. You had already pulled out of the conversation because you knew if you said what you truly felt, no one would be ready to hear it. You became easy to be around because you knew people didn't want honesty. They wanted something simple, agreeable, easy to digest. And you were never that kind of person. You're not good at pretending to be funny. You don't enjoy shallow conversations just to kill time. You can't sit quietly while people gossip. You can't laugh when your heart is breaking inside. And because of that, you began to feel out of place. They said you were too sensitive, but no one understood how many times you had to hold yourself back from saying what you truly saw. They said you were too intense, but no one knew how many times you swallowed your anger just to keep things peaceful. They saw you as quiet, but had no idea how many words you filtered every day, just so you wouldn't be labeled too much. You used to be soft, and they took advantage. You used to be direct, and they pushed you away. You used to be honest, and they turned their backs. You used to care sincerely, and they called it being needy. And so, you withdrew. No drama, no bitterness, no longer needing to be understood. You just wanted peace. But that peace wasn't real peace. It was a silent surrender. Letting go of the hope of being understood, letting go of the need to be accepted, letting go of yourself. In moments when you felt invisible in a world that never saw you, you moved through relationships, conversations, situations, and the same feeling kept pressing down on you. They don't really want me. They just want a softer, easier version of me, so they can breathe more comfortably. You smiled, just so no one would ask. You said, "It's nothing," because you knew, even if you spoke, no one would truly listen. You nodded, but your heart hadn't been there for a long time. Carl Jung once said, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you." You were surrounded, but you didn't belong. You spoke, but no one truly heard. You were present, but people looked right through you. And the deepest wound came from those you once believed would understand, but they were the ones who made you feel the most alone. You started to question yourself. Maybe I shouldn't be so deep. Maybe I should learn how to pretend. Maybe I'm too different. And that difference is a flaw. No, you are not the problem. You're just living in a world where shallowness is celebrated and depth is feared. You're not the issue. You're a mirror, and people don't want to see their real reflection in it. Your sincerity makes them uneasy. Your silence forces them to hear their own thoughts, the ones they've been running from. Your honesty makes them pause and reflect, something they don't want to do in a world that rushes to escape itself. And so, you became the difficult one, the different one, the one who's always quiet, never quite fitting in. But you can't live any other way, because if you pretend, you lose yourself. If you smile just to fit in, you lose your soul. Lonely, but real, or surrounded, but fake. You chose, and the price of truth is always isolation. At first, but from that place, you'll find others like you. People who don't fear truth. People who aren't afraid of depth. People who don't run from feeling. They won't show up right away, but they exist. And they, too, are learning how to live authentically, just like you. So don't mistake the silence of the crowd as a sign you're going the wrong way. Sometimes you're just the first one, brave enough to step outside the cycle of pretense that everyone else keeps repeating. You're not too deep. You're just at the right depth, while others haven't learned how to dive yet. Daniel was the kind of person everyone found easy to get along with. He never raised his voice, never showed annoyance, always said yes when asked for help, always smiled, never disagreed. A kind man, almost to the point of becoming invisible. In social gatherings, Daniel was usually the quiet one, polite, attentive, but rarely interrupting, even when he had a completely different opinion. He was afraid of making others uncomfortable, afraid of being labeled negative, too serious, or difficult. For most of his youth, Daniel tried hard to be a pleasant person. No one hated him, but no one really knew him either. He existed as a safe version of himself, and the cost was losing connection with his true essence. Everything changed one night, in what seemed like a regular hangout, a casual evening among friends, chatting, laughing until the group started gossiping about someone who wasn't there. And for the first time, Daniel spoke up. He wasn't harsh. He didn't attack anyone. He simply said, sincerely, "I don't think it's right to talk about someone behind their back, especially when they're not here to speak for themselves." The room went silent. A few changed the subject. Some chuckled awkwardly. But from that day forward, Daniel began to feel himself being pulled away from the group. Fewer messages, no more invites, no more tags in group chats, no explanation, no drama, just distance. At first, he thought he had done something wrong. He kept questioning himself. I only spoke the truth. I wasn't rude. So why? The answer came slowly, but clearly. It wasn't because Daniel was wrong. It was because he dared to break the unspoken agreement. He stopped playing the role they were all comfortable with, and that unsettled them. One old friend once said to him, "Daniel, you used to be so easy to be around. Now you feel intense, like you're always judging." But Daniel knew he didn't change to be difficult. He just stopped pretending, stopped nodding when he disagreed, stopped smiling when he wasn't okay, stopped enduring things just to be called nice. He was no longer the easygoing shadow of himself. He began to live honestly, and the price was clear. Relationships built on false harmony began to fade away. It was a lonely season. No one said goodbye, but he knew he'd been quietly excluded. It hurt deeply. But one night when everything went quiet, he asked himself, did they leave me? Or did I just step out of an inauthentic world? And then he understood. They didn't reject him. They simply couldn't bear the presence of someone who no longer pretended. Someone like Daniel, once he began living truthfully, was no longer easy to control. No longer easy to manipulate through guilt. No longer easy to label as nice, just to keep him silent. Daniel was no longer the expected nod, no longer the polite smile, no longer the soft shadow others used to feel comfortable next to. He had become a mirror, and those unwilling to face their reflection turned away. From there, Daniel stepped into a new journey. Not many walked beside him, but those who did were real. He learned to live with less noise, but with more depth. He learned to say no without apologizing. He learned to choose honest solitude over fake companionship. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." Daniel, by living truthfully, invited others to confront their own souls, and not everyone was ready. His story is not unique. It happens every day to those who start living honestly, speaking authentically, and stop enduring what no longer feels right. And if you see yourself in this, don't blame yourself. Don't rush to become that agreeable version again. Isolation is not failure. It's a sign you're stepping away from the crowd to return to who you really are. One relationship ends. It doesn't mean you're wrong. One circle closes. It doesn't mean you'll be alone forever. Sometimes, the pain of exclusion is the doorway back to your true self. Daniel once thought, they rejected me, but now he knows. They feared him because he stopped playing along. We often label others' withdrawal with one word, rejection, and we assume when someone pulls away, it must mean something is wrong with us. That thought, although it sounds logical, is a dangerous psychological trap because it blinds us from a greater truth. Not everyone leaves because you were wrong. Sometimes they leave because you were real. You need to understand this. In a world that survives on appearances, authenticity is a threat. When you live honestly, you break the unspoken contract of pretending. You refuse to say what's easy, just to keep the peace. You don't smile through things that are clearly wrong. You don't agree just to stay safe within the group, and that makes others feel exposed. Not because you attack them, but because you exist as a mirror that says nothing, yet quietly unmasks their self-deception. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." People feel uncomfortable around you, not because you're too negative or difficult, but because they've never dared to look within themselves the way you do, and instead of facing it, they choose avoidance. They avoid by walking away. They avoid by labeling you as too much. They avoid by silently crossing you off the list of pleasant people. That's not rejection. That's defense. A common psychological mechanism when someone isn't ready to go deeper. The Stoics taught, it is not things themselves that disturb us, but our opinions about them. Epictetus. You didn't do anything wrong, but the way they perceive you makes them uneasy. They can't control you, and that makes them feel powerless. They can't guilt trip you, so they feel lost. They can't predict your reactions, so they label you hard to connect with. They're not afraid of you. They're afraid of what you represent. You represent clarity. You represent principles. You represent a path that doesn't compromise. A path they don't yet have the courage to walk. So they leave. No drama, no explanations. Just a quiet retreat from the mirror they didn't ask for. You don't need to tone yourself down to keep people. You don't need to simplify who you are so others feel more comfortable. You don't have to shrink yourself just to be labeled nice. If someone needs you to pretend in order to stay, that's not acceptance. That's a subtle form of manipulation, rooted in social expectations. Their rejection was never really about you. It was about the truth you carry. They don't want to live honestly, so they distance themselves from those who do. It's like standing in a dark room, and you're the only one holding a light. Your light doesn't harm anyone, but it forces people to see where they've been hiding, and that makes them uncomfortable. So, don't be surprised when people walk away. Don't retreat just because your honesty wasn't welcomed. You're not being excluded. You simply no longer belong in a circle bound by silent agreement. You're not being rejected. You're just the only one who refused to applaud what's wrong. You're not too sensitive. You're just too awake. And awakeness always unsettles the dreamers. Your clarity is light, and not everyone is ready to step out of the shadows to see things clearly. The problem isn't that you're too much. The problem is they're not enough. Not enough truth. Not enough courage. Not enough willingness to confront the lies they live with. You don't need to blame them, but don't change who you are just to fit into a room where the lights have been turned off for too long. The truth is, not everyone hates you. They just don't all have the strength to stand next to someone who's stopped pretending. And if someone chooses to walk away, let them go. Not because you're unworthy, but because you've already outgrown the loop. They're still afraid to leave. No, you weren't rejected. You were just real, in the wrong place. No, you're not too blunt. You just no longer feel the need to nod and let things slide. No, you're not too sensitive. You're just not as good at pretending as everyone else. No, you didn't make anyone uncomfortable. It's just that your presence revealed what they were trying to hide. No, you didn't change. You simply stopped pretending. You used to be loved because you were easy to be around. But that ease wasn't because you were happy. It was because you stayed silent. You used to be praised as mature, because you didn't react. But in truth, you were just enduring. You were once called wonderful only because you never asked for anything. And the moment you started living truthfully, those compliments disappeared. Because now, you're no longer easy to control. You're no longer willing to be the peacekeeper who buries themselves just to keep others comfortable. Carl Jung once said, "The reason for evil in the world is that people are not able to tell their stories. You've begun telling your real story, and the world around you might not be ready to hear it. They're used to keeping up appearances, so honesty feels offensive. They're used to saying what's pleasing, so clarity feels threatening. They're used to polite compliments, so truth becomes a thorn in their side. But truth doesn't need applause to be true. You don't need validation to live in alignment with yourself. You just need enough courage not to fold yourself into the shape of others' expectations. You are not a mirror meant to make everyone feel flattered. You are yourself, and that alone is a rare thing in this world. Let's repeat, so you remember. You are not being rejected. You just stopped playing a role. You're not being excluded. You just stopped clapping for what you don't believe in. You're not lonely. You just walked off a stage you never wanted to be on in the first place. They didn't abandon you. They're just running from themselves. Every time they see you, you're not too much. They're just too little. Too little courage to face themselves. Too little honesty with their emotions. Too little willingness to change. You don't have to shrink to fit someone's shallowness. You don't have to lighten yourself to help others feel less ashamed of the truth. You don't have to be like them to avoid being labeled hard to be around. The truth is, they don't fear you. They fear what you awaken in them, and that is not your fault. They chose to retreat because they're not ready yet. Not because you deserve to be abandoned. And next time you see a door close, don't assume you're not worthy. Remember this, light always stings the eyes. When people have lived too long in the dark, and you are a light, not the blinding kind, but a quiet kind of truth that can't be ignored. Let's echo the opening line, a final emotional callback. You were not rejected. They just panicked when you stopped playing by their rules. You weren't wrong. You were just more awake, earlier, and deeper. And awakeness is always a lonely road at first, but it's the real one. You've stayed silent many times, not because you had nothing to say, but because deep down, you knew no one was really listening. You've withdrawn many times, not because you wanted to give up, but because every time you tried to step forward, you were misunderstood. You folded yourself just to fit into someone else's heart. But then you realized, no shape of you will ever be enough if they never truly intended to understand, so you chose silence. But from today on, let that silence take a different form, not a silence of surrender, but one of self-possession, not a silence of suffocation, but one of grounded presence. You don't need to explain yourself. You don't need to chase after people who were never deep enough to stay. You don't need to alter yourself, just to exist in a room that rejects the light. Hold on to your true self, even if it leaves you feeling alone at times, because nothing hurts more than being with others and still having to leave yourself behind. You may still be misunderstood, but you'll no longer lose yourself. You may still be left out, but you'll no longer play roles written by someone else. And somewhere out there, there are people walking the same path. They too have been rejected, dismissed, labeled. They too had to choose silence, withdrawal, or playing along. But one day, they'll stop as well, and they'll realize, just like you, rejection isn't the end. It's the door that leads back to your true self. No one can take your truth away unless you abandon it first. No one can make you feel too much unless you let them define you through their shallow lens. No one can shrink you if you've already learned to stand in your own light. From now on, if someone leaves because you're living authentically, let them go. You're not losing someone. You're choosing to keep yourself. Don't be afraid of loneliness. That's when your soul finally hears its own voice. The clearest. Don't be afraid of being misunderstood. The nature of truth is that it doesn't need to be proven. Don't be afraid of people not staying. Real ones will find each other, but only if you dare to be real, all the way through. Stoicism teaches us, if you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid. Epictetus, the authentic ones, are always looked at strangely, but you're not here to please others' eyes. You're here to align with your soul. And if today you find yourself sitting in a room where everyone has turned their back on you, know this. It might be the first time you've finally turned to face yourself. You're not alone. You've just stepped away from the crowd. You haven't been rejected. You've simply refused to keep living a life that no longer feels like your own. You're not too much. They're just not wide enough to hold the truth you carry. And if something still feels stuck in your throat, don't try to forget. Just be still, just for a moment, to see clearly. Then choose yourself again. If you've ever been told you're too much, simply because you felt more deeply than others. If you've ever been called too sensitive, when you were just being real, then the next video is the part meant for you. Stop fixing people. Start understanding yourself. And if fate allows, we'll meet again, right there,